They thought we were weak, just another primitive species clinging to rocks in space. But when they came for our people, they met a monster we call Marine. If you believe in human resilience, grit, and sacrifice, subscribe for more HFY tales where humanity fights back and wins. Proxima Outpost was never meant to be anything more than a distant speck of humanity's quiet ambition, a place for researchers, miners, engineers, and settlers to build something slowly, peacefully. Nestled on the edge of explored space, it was a hub of quiet progress, far from the noise of politics and wars. It had no major military presence, no valuable resources worth fighting for, and no threat to anyone. And that's exactly why people loved it. The settlers who lived there came from different walks of life. Families with children seeking new beginnings. Scientists chasing the purity of unfiltered data. Retired workers who wanted to live out their days in a world that hadn't yet been paved over by greed. Among them was a man named Marcus Clay, once a decorated Marine from Earth's unified forces. He had left behind the medals, the rank, and the blood-soaked memories of war. Proxima offered what nothing else could: silence. Clay lived alone in a modest shelter on the outskirts of the colony. He didn't talk much, didn't attend gatherings, and rarely engaged with the colony council. Most people left him alone, though everyone knew who he was. The children whispered stories about his past, calling him the soldier in the mountains. But he never corrected them. He didn't care to explain. His war was over. Life on the outpost was routine. The sunrises painted the skies in burnt orange. The wind carried the scent of ionized dust, and nights were filled with stargazing and the soft hum of wind turbines. Crops grew slowly in hydrodomes. Mining drones worked beneath the surface in a carefully monitored rhythm. Once a month, a supply ship came in from the inner systems, bringing mail, tools, and medicine. The colony's network was modest, mostly used for scientific transmissions and civilian comms. There was no military traffic, no classified data, just humans trying to survive and thrive. Security was handled by a team of 5, lightly armed, mostly trained for emergencies like wildlife threats or medical evacuations. Even they spent most of their time playing cards or fixing fences. The outpost had gone 5 years without a single hostile incident. No one expected that to change. And then things began to shift. It started with a silence. One morning, the supply ship didn't arrive. No transmissions. No delay warning. Nothing. At first, the council assumed the system's glitch or minor reroute. But then came the second silence, a blackout from Relay Station Theta, the communication satellite that linked Proxima to the rest of the colonies. One of the engineers joked that it was finally time to switch to pigeons. People laughed, but Clay didn't laugh. He sat on the edge of his cabin, watching the sky. Old instincts stirred beneath the calm exterior. He had seen this pattern before, quiet, unexplained, and then suddenly very loud. His first move wasn't to contact anyone. It was to open a buried case beneath his floorboards, one he hadn't touched since arriving. Inside were 3 things: an old service rifle, a rusted combat knife, and a folded flag. The colony council held a meeting to ease concerns. Words like temporary delay and technical malfunction were thrown around. People nodded, pretending it helped. But in the following days, the stars held strange lights, flickers of movement that didn't match any known flight path. A mining drone detected faint radiation spikes in the upper atmosphere. Power readings dipped in and out. Then came the sound. Low, unnatural humming across the valley at night, like the sky itself was holding its breath. Marcus Clay walked into the colony one morning, something he rarely did. His presence alone was enough to silence the crowd at the food hall. He didn't speak long. Just 4 words. Start preparing for attack. The council chuckled nervously. The settlers muttered among themselves. Most didn't take it seriously. The idea of being targeted. It seemed ridiculous. What did they have that anyone wanted? And if it really were a threat, wouldn't the inner systems have warned them? But Clay had seen this too. The enemy doesn't always come for your resources. Sometimes they come for the message. A soft target. A warning to others. And humanity's expansion had been drawing attention. Within the next 12 hours, all illusions were shattered. The first wave hit the orbital relay, vaporizing it in a silent flash of light. The colony's long-range comms went dark. Then came the skies, 3 unknown vessels breaking through the atmosphere, sleek and black, bearing no insignia. They moved with terrifying precision, disabling grid power and initiating pinpoint strikes on defense structures. The 5-man security team didn't last 5 minutes. Screams filled the air. Families ran for emergency shelters. Mining shafts became hiding spots. Automated systems failed one by one. It was chaos. But Marcus Clay didn't run. He walked into the storm, calmly, deliberately, as if he had been waiting for it all along. The quiet days of Proxima Outpost were over, and something far older, far darker, had just awakened. The ships that descended on Proxima Outpost were not meant for communication. There were no lights of diplomacy, no signals of peace. They bore no banners, no flags, no symbols of intent. Their silence was the only language they spoke, and it was deafening. These were not messengers. They were executioners. The colony's perimeter defenses, weak as they were, never activated. Power stations had been taken out before anyone could reach them. Backup batteries failed within minutes, as if someone had anticipated emergency protocols. The attackers knew the layout, the systems, even the blind spots. It wasn't just an invasion. It was a surgical removal. Explosions rippled across the outpost, not random but targeted. The communication array was obliterated first, then the transport pads, then the storage silos. Whatever or whoever had come, they had a goal: isolation. Proxima was being cut off, not just from help, but from history, as if it were being erased. Those who didn't flee were frozen in place, confused by the suddenness of it all. This wasn't a planet prepared for defense. It was a research colony, a mining post, a sanctuary for those seeking peace. And in less than an hour, it was something else entirely. A battlefield. The enemy, though still unnamed, was efficient. Drones swept through the streets, scanning and identifying targets. Anyone seen holding a weapon, even a basic tool, was eliminated. They moved without sound, without warning. No attempt was made to communicate. No demands were issued. Civilians were not captured, interrogated, or warned. They were either ignored or eliminated. Within the central dome, the council finally understood. This wasn't a raid. It wasn't a conflict over territory or minerals. This was extermination. Proxima Outpost had become a message, and humanity was its audience. Panic set in. The council gave the order to initiate full evacuation, knowing it was already too late for most. In the midst of the chaos, escape shuttles were launched. Not all made it. Several were targeted before even lifting off. But a few got away, just enough to carry the warning that Proxima had fallen. The rest of the population scattered. Some ran for the underground shafts. Others hid in maintenance tunnels, hoping the attackers wouldn't search too deep. Many simply froze, unable to process what was happening. But one man had already moved. Marcus Clay, the former Marine, did not run or hide. He disappeared into the abandoned sectors of the mining grid, areas long sealed off due to structural instability. While others searched for shelter, he searched for tools. While others cried for help, he calculated. The instinct of a soldier had never truly left him. He didn't need an explanation. The reason didn't matter. Only the outcome did. He began collecting supplies. Old wiring, compressed gas tanks, outdated fusion cells, industrial cutters, and broken drones. While the enemy swept through the colony, he prepared something they didn't expect: resistance. The attackers believed they had already won. And in most ways, they had. The colony was disabled, the infrastructure was destroyed, and the people were broken. But in their arrogance, they had overlooked one variable that had rewritten history time and again: the human refusal to die quietly. There were a handful of survivors still moving, engineers, technicians, a few miners. Clay found them. He gave them no speech, no hope, only instructions. And they followed, not because they believed they could win, but because doing nothing felt worse. The alternative was sitting in a tunnel, waiting to die. Clay knew he couldn't stop the invasion, but he could slow it down. He could make them bleed. He could remind them who humans were, not cattle, not insects, not just another species to dominate. The attackers, though advanced, had made assumptions. That was their mistake. They assumed their tech superiority guaranteed victory. They assumed that an unarmed colony would offer no threat. They assumed that no one would have the will to fight back. They had not met Marcus Clay. As the dust settled over Proxima, the invaders began fortifying their control zones. Their goal, clearly, extended beyond destruction. They were staying. They were building something, a command hub, a relay station, perhaps even a forward base. Proxima wasn't just a target. It was a foothold, but in the ruins, the quiet shadows stirred. Tunnels once abandoned came alive with hidden movement. Doors were rigged with improvised charges. Power nodes were rewired for overload. Drones disappeared, only to return with altered programming. Clay had turned the colony itself into a weapon. The enemy may have landed unopposed, but what awaited them now was not a military response. It was something older, more primal. Survival turned to vengeance. Humanity's answer to extermination wasn't surrender. It was retaliation. And it had already begun. The colony's heart no longer pulsed with routine. Where once there was a saw from turbines and the chatter of workers, there now lay silence, broken only by the distant mechanical rhythm of the enemy patrols. The outpost, once full of light and warmth, had become a husk, cold, dead, and watched. But within its shadows, something old and dangerous had begun to stir. The invaders moved methodically. Their patrols were timed, routes calculated, equipment advanced. They weren't just claiming the outpost. They were studying it, mapping every corridor, scanning every life sign, and logging every piece of machinery. They worked with the precision of a species that had done this many times before. This was not their first conquest, but in their clinical precision, they overlooked the unpredictable nature of human defiance. Their algorithms didn't account for individuals like Marcus Clay. Their pattern recognition didn't detect a sudden change in wiring inside a maintenance tunnel or the tampering of an access panel that hadn't been touched in years. They didn't notice the missing tools from storage closets or the repurposing of fusion batteries that were deemed obsolete. Clay had created a network of resistance, not a formal army, but a threadbare chain of survivors with enough skill, will, and fury to strike back. He gave no rousing speeches, no elaborate plans. The mission was simple: harass, sabotage, bleed the enemy, make them regret every inch of ground they took. The outpost tunnels, once used for mining operations, became the first battleground. Clay and his small team rigged crew traps using leftover mining gear, pressure-triggered gas ignitions, reprogrammed welding drones, and collapsing ceilings rigged with timed supports. Patrols that entered the lower shafts either didn't return or came back in pieces. The invaders adjusted, but they could never fully anticipate where or how the next attack would come. Above ground, the attackers had installed a command relay to begin transmitting data back to their fleet. It was their connection to the larger war machine beyond the stars. But within days, that relay glitched and went offline. Not destroyed, just corrupted enough to send fragments of scrambled data, laced with false readings. It was the first sign that they were not in control. The first sign that this occupation was not proceeding as planned. Clay's team grew bolder. Small victories gave birth to larger risks. They began collecting enemy weapons from fallen units, reverse engineering power cells, and mapping patrol patterns. Each action was calculated not for survival, but for resistance. They weren't trying to outlast the enemy. They were trying to outthink them. Among the survivors were a few engineers who had once worked on defense protocols. With Clay's guidance, they repurposed the colony's excavation AI into surveillance drones. The attackers, assuming the machines were harmless utility bots, didn't notice the subtle shifts in behavior until those bots began delivering explosive packages to their supply zones. Still, the resistance was not without cost. Every success came with loss. Every trap set required someone to stay behind. Each data relay corrupted needed a tech to climb into a zone, crawling with patrols. And every skirmish drew harsher retaliation. The enemy increased their aggression. Civilians caught in the wrong place at the wrong time were executed without hesitation. Anyone aiding the resistance was marked and hunted. But fear no longer governed the survivors. Something else had taken hold: rage, pride, and the knowledge that they had nothing left to lose. Proxima was already gone. Their homes were ash, their families scattered or dead. What remained was not a colony. It was a message in the making. The attackers, still unnamed and silent, began to recognize a pattern. Their initial overconfidence turned to caution. Patrols became heavier. Sensors were deployed more frequently. They began scanning old debris, tracking heat signatures, and reinforcing weak zones. But every time they adapted, Clay shifted tactics. He understood warfare in ways their algorithms couldn't predict. He knew that sometimes victory wasn't about strength. It was about endurance. And humanity had learned how to endure across thousands of years of pain. Clay's name was never broadcast, never spoken openly. But among the survivors, he became a symbol, an idea more than a man. If he could fight, they could too. If he didn't run, neither would they. Rumors of his actions spread like fire through tunnels and whispered comms. The man who never gave up. The ghost who hunted the invaders. The human who turned an outpost into a graveyard. The enemy had come expecting submission. They received resistance. They had come expecting to write a message of dominance. Instead, they were reading a warning. The longer they stayed, the more they bled. And deep beneath the surface of the outpost, Clay was preparing something more. Something they wouldn't expect. Something that would not just push them back, but mark them forever. The stand had begun, and it would not end quietly. The invaders began to change their tactics. Their movements became less predictable, their patterns more erratic. They had started reacting not as a dominant force, but as one under threat. The air around the colony grew heavier with surveillance drones, and strange metallic towers began to rise from the ground, devices humming with frequencies outside the human range. Machines meant to detect, control, or suppress. Still, they failed to eliminate the resistance completely. Every countermeasure deployed by the enemy was answered with disruption. Their sensors were blinded by electromagnetic pulses constructed from salvaged mining equipment. Their drones were hijacked mid-air using primitive signal floods. Their heavy infantry began to vanish one by one in zones that had once been declared safe. The very systems the attackers had disrupted were now weaponized against them. Lights flickered at the wrong moments. Doors opened into traps. Automated machines acted as if they remembered what side they once served. The invaders were a technologically superior force, but they had entered a war without understanding its shape. They thought in numbers and formulas, in probabilities. But humans had never played by clean rules. They fought with desperation sharpened into ingenuity. And on Proxima, every loss forged a new tactic. The survivors stopped thinking of escape. That dream had died with the second wave of evac ships. What remained now was war, not for territory or victory, but for message and meaning. The outpost had become a battlefield not worth saving, but worth remembering. Its people, those still breathing, chose not to beg or surrender. They chose to become the virus in the system. Unclean, unpredictable, unkillable. Deep in the old hydroponic sectors, engineers reconfigured the atmospheric controls to simulate structural failures, drawing patrols into false emergencies. The moment the enemy arrived, they were met with thermal spikes and chemical fog that interfered with their optics. Miners took old drilling lasers, rewired their safeties, and turned them into makeshift ambush weapons. What was once a garden for crops had become a jungle of smoke and death. The resistance began sending signals, not to the stars, but into the enemy's own systems. Code embedded in corrupted drones, echoing from disrupted relay points, mimicking internal commands. The invaders' machines began to glitch. Small errors at first, a delay in targeting, a misfire in defense mode. Then came larger fractures. Entire patrols going silent without explanation, defense turrets locking onto their own support bots, internal communication lines blaring static and rhythmic pulses. Each failure confused the enemy more. And confusion in war is a slow death. What the attackers hadn't understood was that humanity's greatest weapon had always been its memory. Every scar, every loss, every invasion throughout human history had written itself into the species' soul. There had been wars before, on Earth, across its nations, than among the stars. And in each, humans had learned that survival was enough. They had to leave a mark. A lesson. Proxima was becoming that lesson. Reports from the outer systems had begun to circulate. Fragmented transmissions, corrupted files, blurry images of black ships over red skies. Other colonies were listening, watching. Even as the outpost signal was blocked, its silence began to scream, and the enemy felt it. This colony was not falling. It was transforming. In the ruins of the Central Archive, a data core was retrieved and modified. Clay's team embedded a memory crystal within it, one that contained logs, footage, schematics, names of the fallen, and footage of the resistance efforts. A dead drop for the future, a monument in digital form. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a record, a warning to others, a message to the stars. We did not die quietly. The enemy tried to destroy it, but they were always one step too late. The resistance moved it daily, sometimes hourly, between locations. At one point, it was hidden inside the shell of a destroyed scout drone. Another time, beneath a false power conduit disguised to emit deadly radiation. The attackers sent their machines searching endlessly. But memory is slippery, and in Proxima, it had grown claws. By the third week of the siege, the attackers began pulling back from certain sectors. Not retreating, just avoiding. Areas too costly to patrol. Zones where their units vanished without trace. They had won the surface, but lost the ground. They held the skies, but not the tunnels. They possessed the outpost, but not its spirit. In their silence, the invaders had hoped to speak only through action. But humans had answered with fire, defiance, an ancient language of resistance. One written in sabotage, sacrifice, and unyielding will. Whatever came next, one truth was already branded into walls, into the wreckage, into the dying light of the outpost horizon. They had not broken humanity. They had awakened it. The enemy had shifted into containment mode, no longer chasing ghosts through tunnels or springing traps with their patrols. They fortified their core zones and pulled tighter around their command towers. Their drones patrolled inward instead of outward. Their units clustered closer together. The outer sectors of Proxima were labeled compromised, not by damage, but by uncertainty. For the first time, the invaders feared the dark. The resistance, thin in numbers but thick in purpose, turned that fear into a weapon. They amplified it with carefully timed strikes, creating patterns that never repeated. A mining shaft detonated at precisely the same moment. A supply convoy vanished without trace. Hours later, a control panel in a fortified node exploded from within. A result of nothing more than coolant tubes rigged with pressure seals and ancient timing chips. Each hit felt coordinated, but there was no central command. Just shared fury, shared memory, and a shared refusal to allow extinction without legacy. The attackers had assumed that by cutting off communication, they had severed the colony's connection to hope. But in truth, they had created something else. Isolation didn't create despair, it condensed resolve. The absence of outside help forced every survivor to look inward, not to be saved, but to become the sword. The invasion did not fracture Proxima. It unified it. Trapped deep within collapsed ruins, injured workers reprogrammed cargo haulers into mobile bombs. A child, left orphaned in the chaos, spent days sneaking between abandoned facilities to deliver power cells to hiding engineers. Elderly technicians wrote down enemy troop patterns with chalk and stone, then passed their notes to runners trained by soldiers who no longer remembered what peace looked like. No one was safe, but everyone contributed. This was no longer Clay's war. It was Proxima's. The invaders began deploying atmosphere suppressors to thin the oxygen for submission, but the humans adapted. They built micro-scrubbers from old terraforming modules, stockpiled breathable reserves, and carved out pressurized safe zones in the deepest caverns. Every biological threat introduced by the enemy, chemical dispersants, synthetic pathogens, was answered with a low-tech counter. Not perfect, not elegant, but enough. The enemy started executing captives on public screens, trying to instill terror. But instead of fear, the footage invoked fury. Those shown dying weren't forgotten. They were honored, their names carved into walls, their deaths added to the archive crystals still circulating through the tunnels. Each loss became another chapter in a growing ledger, one written not to mourn, but to rage. Proxima no longer resisted for survival. It resisted for memory, for the idea that humanity, no matter how outgunned or outmatched, never surrendered its identity. The colony wasn't fighting to win. It was fighting to ensure the enemy never forgot the cost of provoking Earthborn life. Somewhere, beneath the scorched corridors and shattered domes, Clay and a dwindling team worked on what came next. They had watched enough patterns, recorded enough responses, tested enough theories. The enemy did not improvise well. They were efficient, powerful, and cold, but not adaptable. They expected war to follow equations. Clay would rewrite those, using stolen tech stripped from broken patrols, salvaged fusion cores, and AI subroutines smuggled into maintenance bots. The Resistance began construction of something final. Not a bomb, not a ship, not a weapon, a symbol, a beacon not of distress, but defiance. It would not call for rescue. It would broadcast the truth, the story of Proxima, the story of resistance. The signal would be short, encrypted, and relentless. It would use the enemy's own relay system, hidden behind a wall of corrupted code and falsified energy spikes. The goal wasn't to be heard by Earth's military. The goal was to be heard by everyone. Smugglers, miners, fringe settlements, colonies in the quiet dark that feared the same fate. If Proxima could resist, so could they. If Proxima could wound the unstoppable, then perhaps the unstoppable could be stopped. The invaders unknowingly fueled this final act. Their ignorance, their reliance on pattern recognition, gave Clay's team the opening they needed. While they watched the tunnels, the Resistance moved through ventilation shafts. While they jammed signal towers, the engineers transmitted through grounded wires. While they prepared for an uprising, they missed the revolution already underway beneath their feet. Time was running thin. Supplies were gone. Ammunition was low. Medical care was reduced to field dressings and pain tolerance. But the humans did not stop. Not because they believed they could win, but because some wars didn't need victory to matter. Some wars needed only to be remembered. The signal was ready. Not perfect, not polished, but real. It pulsed from a jury-rigged transmitter buried beneath a collapsed storage depot, masked by the noise of the outpost's ruined energy grid. Encoded in layers of corrupted machine language, the broadcast mimicked background system traffic. To most sensors, it appeared as static, meaningless chatter. But to human ears or any system that had once communicated with Earth, the signal carried something unmistakable. Truth. The message began with coordinates. Then came names, the names of every fallen civilian, every lost child, every executed technician. Not numbers, names. After that came the images, grainy, flickering frames of resistance. A mining tunnel collapsing on a patrol. A reprogrammed loader unit dragging a stolen power cell. A civilian, holding the line with nothing but an arc welder. Then came the sound. A single phrase repeated in dozens of voices, layered with distortion, but clear enough to shatter silence. We are not extinct. The invaders didn't notice at first. Their command AI dismissed the anomaly as system noise. But as the signal grew stronger, hopping across nodes, echoing from hidden boosters, and embedding itself in abandoned terminals, they reacted. Suppressor towers reoriented. Signal filters tightened. Drones began scanning for the transmission source. Still, they failed to isolate it. Each time they shut down one node, two more went live elsewhere. The network wasn't linear. It had been designed like a colony, chaotic, adaptive, and human. The Resistance hadn't built a signal. They had built a virus of memory, one that couldn't be erased because it lived in every corner of the outpost. On data chips, in airlocks, behind loose floor panels, inside coolant pipes, even etched on micro walls of broken drones. The broadcast wasn't asking for help. It was declaring survival. Across the stars, at the edge of forgotten relays, distant colonies began to receive fragments. Half-scrambled data blocks, faint audio logs, corrupted video feeds, all containing pieces of Proxima's truth. Freighters on deep routes picked up ghost echoes and carried them further. Pirate ships, smugglers, and fringe settlements intercepted bursts they couldn't decode but chose to preserve. The signal spread not through strength, but through persistence. In the heart of the outpost, the invaders finally realized a threat. Not a military threat, not a tactical risk, but something worse. A legacy. They began purging everything. Rooms were incinerated. Terminals were melted. Storage cores were shattered. But for every crystal destroyed, another was already moving through the tunnels. For every node silenced, another whispered from deep underground. The resistance didn't fight back directly. They let the enemy burn their own maps. They let them tear down infrastructure. With each act of destruction, the invaders weakened themselves further, exhausting resources, losing position, and creating gaps the resistance exploited to plant more echoes. The humans had stopped acting like defenders. They had become saboteurs of meaning, memory carriers, fireflies in the ruins. Even those who once doubted Clay's efforts now carried cables, hid memory chips in clothing, and spoke the phrase aloud in the darkness as if it were sacred. We are not extinct. The enemy command structure began to glitch. Autonomous units failed to sync. Orders were delayed, distorted, or disobeyed. A rogue broadcast began looping through one of the enemy's own towers, repeating footage of patrol vanishing into mist. Confusion turned into panic. In their need to control the narrative, the invaders had never considered they might become part of one. Back on Earth, no one had heard from Proxima in weeks. The system was flag lost. But when the first full data packet finally arrived, relayed by a passing freighter, stored in a low-priority buffer, it detonated across the network. It was raw, imperfect, unverified, but it was enough. Enough to prove humans were still alive. Enough to show the enemy was vulnerable. Enough to remind the universe that Earth-born species did not vanish quietly. From Mars to Titan, from Ceres to Luna, from the orbital cities to the far-flung mining belts, whispers began to rise. If Proxima could fight, anyone could. If Proxima could resist extinction, then the war was not lost. The invaders' silence was no longer power. It was weakness. And Proxima, battered and blood-soaked, became a symbol of the one thing no algorithm could predict. Hope weaponized. The outpost no longer resembled a colony. The infrastructure had collapsed into chaos. Power grids sputtered. Water systems failed. Oxygen scrubbers operated on jury-rigged overrides. Most above-ground structures were flattened or gutted. But beneath the destruction, something endured. The last resistance members operated without names, ranks, or roles. They had become functions of a greater organism, each one a limb, an eye, a memory. Their goals were no longer tactical, but symbolic. Every act, every signal, every breath spent beneath failing ceilings served only one purpose: continuity. Not of the body, but of the idea. The invaders had reduced their presence to surgical sweeps. No more patrols. No more warnings. Now they sent exterminators, silent units programmed to cleanse the final pockets. Precision killers, efficient and thoughtless. Yet even these advanced machines failed to silence the flicker. It wasn't a war anymore. It was erosion. A slow decay of invader momentum. The more they pressed, the deeper they sank into a maze of human unpredictability. Nothing left to conquer. Nothing left to secure. Only the persistent, pulsing rhythm of a species refusing to vanish. One by one, the final transmitters were discovered and destroyed. The enemy celebrated each as a victory, not realizing the true transmission had already spread. The backups were not physical. They were biological, carried in memory, spoken between dying breaths, encoded into the smallest surviving systems, embedded in personal logs, scattered through old mining bots still roaming the wreckage without orders. The message had become self-sustaining. The last data crystal, encrypted beyond decryption, contained more than names and footage. It held strategy, insight, and adaptation logs. It detailed enemy tactics and weaknesses, compiled through weeks of resistance. It was smuggled into a decoy drone, launched in trajectories so slow and random it avoided detection. No heat signature. No burst transmission. Just drift, aimless to the enemy, inevitable to anyone listening for ghosts. The outpost began to fall silent. But silence wasn't surrender. Silence was seeding. In far-off colonies, the fragments bloomed, Patchwork stories were assembled from corrupted files and half-heard messages. Communities gathered to listen to distorted voices from another world. They didn't hear defeat. They heard defiance. An unarmed tech sabotaging an enemy relay station with only a wrench and spite. A medic using her last dose of painkiller not to numb herself, but to keep a comrade breathing long enough to deliver a memory chip. An old miner refusing evacuation to stay behind, and booby-trapped the very rock he once extracted. Their names, their actions, their resolve, immortalized. Across the frontier, other outposts stopped waiting for help. They built shields out of scrapyard metal. They trained civilians in ambush tactics. They modified tools into weapons. They downloaded Proxima's transmission and added their own. The archive grew. The enemy, once seen as gods of conquest, began to feel the burden of repetition. Every colony became a question mark. Every approach, a potential trap. Their systems faltered in the presence of irregular resistance. Their models broke against asymmetric defiance. They started calculating losses, not in battles, but in morale. Proxima was no longer a location. It was a story. The cost of attacking humanity was no longer measured in territory gained, but in the virus of rebellion left behind. A war that didn't end when the shooting stopped. A battle that continued through whispers, warnings, and wounds that never closed. By the time Earth officially acknowledged the broadcast, it was too late to mourn. The outpost was gone. The lives were lost. But the war had already shifted. The silence of Proxima had become the anthem of hundreds. Humans had rewritten the ending. Extinction had been denied. Not by force, but by refusal. Refusal to be forgotten. Refusal to obey the silence. Refusal to be erased by a species that understood only conquest, but not consequence. The enemy would remember Proxima, not as a victory, but as the colony that bled into eternity. And so, the Proxima Outpost fell, but its memory rose like fire across the stars. A colony wiped from maps, but carved forever into hearts of those who dared to resist. This wasn't just survival. This was humanity at its most defiant. We are not extinct. We are the storm that comes after silence. We are the story your machines can't delete. If the story sparks something in you, that fire, that grit, that pride in the human spirit, hit the like button to keep the resistant alive. Subscribe for more tales where humanity fights back and fights harder, and drop a comment below.